On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, it's the May 31st, 2022 edition of What the Ship, top 5 stories across global shipping. I'm your host, Sal Mercoglano. Welcome to this episode of What's Going On with Shipping. So, a lot going on, obviously, across the board in global shipping. So, we're going to hop right into our stories for this week. Before I do so, if you can, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's jump into the first story. So, just did a hit this morning with Freight Waves Now, talking about 2 stories that are going to be the central part here for our first one. And the first element here was the appointment of General Steve Lyons, who used to be the commander of the United States Transportation Command, to be the new port envoy, replacing John Bakari, who stepped down back in April. The story I want to reference is this one by John Conrad over at G Captain, where he talks about the 3 major challenges that are facing General Lyons taking on the role as the port envoy. And one of the first things he identifies is the issue of American sea blindness. The fact that for most Americans, they don't really see what's going on with the sea. We have been pretty absent from it for a long time. And most Americans, until very recently, were unaware how much our trade commerce relies on the ocean. Second thing he talks about is marine and military finance. Putting General Lyons in charge as port envoy is great. I've seen General Lyons in action and have actually communicated with him. I think he's top notch in many ways. However, a military person taking the role that was held by an assistant secretary of transportation is a bit different. You can't just go in and order private companies to do things. This is not, unfortunately, a natural disaster or an emergency. I don't know, unfortunately, why I said that, but anyway, it's not a natural disaster or an emergency. It's not like General Honore going into Katrina back in 2005. Lyons is going to have to work with commercial firms that are busy making profits and have boards they have to report to. And most military people don't talk about finance. Yeah, they talk about budget, but they don't talk about venture capital and financing. And that's a big issue. And then the third thing that John talks about here is really the fabric of military planning and how military planning, large staffs, large entities, that's not something that General Lyons is going to have access to as the port envoy. And it's going to be really difficult to do this. And what John identified in the story, which I think is really important, is 3 things. He's going to need help in getting the story across and being able to talk about it. I mean, he's a capable storyteller. One of the things that stands out for me with General Lyons was when Surge Sealift, the Sealift Reserve Sealift fleet that was in poor condition, he reported to Congress on multiple occasions, but he actually conducted a readiness test that demonstrated its failure. Not many commanders would take a risk like that, but General Lyons did. And so I think that's a big thing. He talks about finance. Obviously, we just talked about finance a minute ago, but then he talks about fabric, which is a really interesting thing. And John and a few other people have written about this idea for creating a new maritime advanced research project agency, kind of like DARPA, but for the maritime element. And I fairly agree with most of what John says here, but I will say that there's another issue that's lingering here, and that is that Steve Lyons is going to face a situation that John Bakari didn't face, in that he's going to have some competition out there, and one of those competitions is going to come from the Federal Maritime Commission. The FMC, and this story here from Freightwaves talks about this. Daniel Maffei, the chairman, as he's leading a revised FMC, I would argue, a much more kind of vocal FMC that wants to do more with the regulation of ocean shipping. And therefore, that's a big issue that didn't really exist during the period of Bakari. We just saw this big ruling against Hauppauge Lloyd by the FMC, $822,000 in detention fees. They really want to make sure that contracting is fair and visible to everybody. And one of the biggest is their competition antitrust suits. One of the commissioners, Rebecca Dye, just completed and submitted her report on Fact Finding 29 that basically identifies those issues. And when Maffei went before the US Congress, he asked for a 5% increase to his budget for more people, more oversight, more abilities. So obviously General Lyons, as the new port envoy, has a lot to do. He reports directly to the president and Secretary Buttigieg. I still think, and I mentioned this in that Freightwaves piece, that the 4 horsemen of the Buttigieg, those are the head of maritime, air, land or road and rail should be the key element. And I think, one of the things I'd like to see is how Lyons' position as port envoy maybe morphs into a liaison role between those four agencies, briefing the Secretary of Transportation and talking about it. Again, Bakari came in with a lot of background. He knew civilian agencies. He'd worked with these companies. He had some background. Lyons from the military side, yeah, he's worked with commercial firms before, but those are firms with contracts with the government. Now he's got to get buy-in from commercial firms who don't have buy-in with the military. And that's going to be a difficult thing, I think, but I'm interested to see how it goes. I'm going to give all the support I can to General Lyons. Again, I think he's outstanding. So let's go to story number 2. So we have a huge issue going on right now on the West Coast with this contract negotiation between the ILWU, the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union, and the Pacific Maritime Association, that the contract expires the end of June. We've already been told it's going to go past that. So they're not going to have a new contract in place. They're still going to work, supposedly. They'll keep going, but they're still working on that contract. The issue here has to do with automation and how much change will go in the port. Well, this story from Freightways from Todd Maiden. Southern California ports rank dead last on Global Efficiency Indexed. And the story here is key. After a year of headlines lamenting a congested supply chain, a report ranking port efficiency made it official Southern California ports were the least efficient in 2021. The backlog of ships waiting in San Pedro last year topped 100. It's right now around 25. A threshold that didn't consistently abate until Lunar New Year of 2022. That is February of 2022. The report in particular is this report right here. This is the Transport Global Practice, the Container Port Performance Index of 2021, put out by the World Bank Group. This is a product of basically IHS. And what they do is they look at all the ports around the world, and they look at everything in terms of port efficiency. And when you look at port efficiency, what they're doing is looking at a variety of different characteristics. I'll go in here to the rankings. So here is their global ranking of container ports. Number 1 is King Abdullah Port in Saudi Arabia. In first place, the Port of Salah in Oman comes in second place, and largely the Middle East takes the top 3 rankings. You'll see a Chinese port, Yangshan, come in at number 4. You go back to the Middle East for number 5, Tangier in the Mediterranean, number 6, that's in North Africa. Ningbo, Jeddah, Jiangzhou, Yokohama are in the top 10. But US ports, in particularly the ports of LA and Long Beach, come in not last, but dead last. The port of Long Beach at 369 and the port of Los Angeles at 370. Now they have an entire section here on their approach and methodology, how they go about determining what is the rankings here. They go everything from the anatomy of an individual port call, what does that involve in all the different areas. They talk about arrival times, how long they're in there, the port performance programs, how they construct this with import time, consumption, obviously crane availability, congestion, all those ports come in there. They talk about crane moves, really a lot of great detail, actually. If you really want to know how ports operate, you really get a chance here to see all the material and data that goes into this. In terms of in North America, they break this down also by region. The Port of Virginia is really the top ranked US port at a rank of 23. A lot of investment have been going into the Port of Virginia, particularly in the Norfolk area. And you see it paying off. Port of Miami at number 29, Wilmington, North Carolina at number 49. Now, Miami and Wilmington are fairly small ports in terms of handling containers. Same thing with Philadelphia and Tampa, as you see there. Baltimore, probably the biggest improvement that you've seen with a major port that's developing. Jacksonville, really on the cusp. And you really don't see, again, big US ports on here. You get down to like 119 where you start seeing Houston in there, Charleston, Savannah, way down the list, 367, Vancouver, Canada, 368, and then again, Long Beach and Los Angeles right at the bottom. It also breaks it out by large ports. So ports over 4 million TEU per year. And I have to question that a little bit too. I almost think that you need a new, larger category because, again, you've got LA and Long Beach handling about 10 million containers a year. Shanghai's at 47 million. I mean, you're almost talking about a new kind of, mega large or very large port index. But when you look at, again, this ranking, you'll see, again, the United States pretty low on this list. When you talk about large ports, go down this list, again, you really don't see the United States enter this port list until you get to 251 with New York and New Jersey. And again, Savannah at 367 and Long Beach in LA at 369 and 370. The news story here has a couple of issues that they highlight. A multitude of factors led to the large quay of ships on the West Coast last year. COVID-induced labor headways at the port, slow chassis turnaround, lack of container staging space, slow rail service, and containers out of position in the network provided some of the biggest impediments to throughput. But the report found that most of the least efficient ports have common issues. Quote, poorly performing ports are characterized by limitations in spatial and operating efficiency, limitations in maritime and landside access, inadequate oversight and poor conditions between the public agencies involved, resulting in a lack of predictability and reliability. Again, I go back to that issue is what is our national port strategy? What I would want our port czar to be doing in conjunction with the FMC and the new head of the Maritime Administration, Ann Phillips, who has the power of the purse string. She controls the allocation of grant money through the infrastructure bill to the ports. What are we doing with our ports? Are we investing in the four corner strategy? Are we going for four big ports, LA, Long Beach, Houston, Savannah, New York, New Jersey? Or are we going to be investing in smaller ports, diffusing out? What are we doing with that? And again, I think that's an element that we need to be looking at going forward. We just can't keep operating under the same system. Again, go back to 2015 when the FMC wrote a report and identified nearly all of this beforehand. And I actually think too, let me be clear, just one other thing I'll add to this one. I think Long Beach got the butt end of that deal. I think Long Beach was much more efficient than they're being ranked there, particularly the LBC terminal. They've implemented a lot of changes in that terminal. I really think they got dragged down because of what happened in both LA and Long Beach, because they're really one big, huge mega terminal there. And so I think that was a little bit of a dig at them. But we've seen that happen, and there may be some bias in that report against American ports for whatever reason. I'm not sure, but we definitely see the American ports ranking there pretty low. All right, let's jump over to story number 3. So we go to the war in Russia and Ukraine, and one of the things we see here has to deal with the issue of the export of Russian oil. Now, we talked about this the other day and the other week, where not every country is banning Russian oil, but here, this story from Maritime Executive, European Council agrees to ban seaborne imports of Russian oil. Council has agreed in principle to ban seaborne imports of oil from Russia, leaving a carve out for pipeline shipments in order to secure the vote of Hungary and other states highly dependent on Russian crude. The sanctions will immediately impact 75% of Russian oil imports, and at the end of the year, 90% of the Russian oil imported into Europe will be banned, said European Council President Charles Michel in the statement. The council has also agreed to ban Seaborne, Russia's largest bank, from the SWIFT financial messaging system. It also banned Russian vessels from the EU insurance market, a move expected to severely crimp the access of Russian ship owners to P&I. This is protection and indemnity coverage. This ensures the cargo. The EU also provided Ukraine with about $10 billion in direct financial aid to help meet its immediate budgetary needs. So a big move by the EU to do this. But again, they can't cut all these countries that have become overly dependent on Russian fuel and oil off, and particularly Hungary, which had a veto on this. And so they needed to basically placate this. Is it cutting all Russian oil off? No. But it's cutting the oil the oil shipments by sea. This, of course, goes hand in hand with the story I reported on the other day, which I did a video on, which is the Iranian seizure of Greek tankers. This goes back to a story where the U.S. has been seizing initially Russian tankers, but in this case, the story goes that the Greeks seized a Russian flag tanker that was carrying Iranian oil. and they now transferred that oil from that Russian tanker to an American chartered Liberian flagged tanker. That's not confusing. I don't know what it is, but that is the world of international shipping. But to counter that, Iran seized 2 Greek tankers in the Persian Gulf and are now holding them off the port of Bandar Abbas in the Persian Gulf. The Greeks have warned their own shipping to avoid Iranian territorial waters. That is a very difficult thing to do when you have to transit the Straits of Hormuz between the Persian Gulf and the northern Arabian Sea. But we know that they're holding this. A lot of people commenting on the story I did on this. Number one, I pronounced Iran improperly. I apologize about that. Again, dumb American. And my pronunciations are not my forte. Iran is the correct pronunciation, as I was told repeatedly. Second thing I was told too is that the crew are free to go, which, let me be clear. When you land a helicopter on a deck of a tanker and you seize it, that's, it's fine to say the crew is free to go, but they're really not at that moment when they're forced to sail the vessel into a port. That's really not freedom at that moment. So these ships have been seized. Whether the crews can go or not, who knows, but they've been seized and are now in Iranian territorial waters at this point. And so what happens here, we don't know. We don't know what the next step is going to be. We've seen this happen before. We had the seizure of a British tanker. We had the seizure of a Korean tanker by Iran. Those incidents took time. The British tanker was held for more than 2 months. Back in 2019, the Korean vessel was held for about a month during that time period. So not exactly sure what happens with this. But again, this creates instability in the world's oil markets. And when you have instability in markets, that creates doubt. Doubt means higher freight rates, and that means more money for everybody. So that was story number 3. Story number 4 comes from Splash 24/7. Author Andrew Craig Bennett, who I just started conversing with on Twitter, wrote this great story about those Ukrainian ton miles. So this deals with the issue of shipping goods over distances. And one of the biggest things that is sometimes missed when we start talking about, being able to ship goods a long distance is it's not just the tonnage. It's the distance that tonnage has to move, because the more weight and the more miles you do, it becomes exponentially more difficult to do this. And one of the things you're seeing here is this laid out. So the silos and elevators of Ukraine are full of the unexported 2021 harvest. The logistics of this predicament looks a bit like this. The ports of Ukraine are closed. Russia is blockading them with their Black Sea fleet. Plus, there's mines laid by both Ukrainians and Russians. Yes, we can move on rail, but Ukrainian railways are Russian gauge, while the railways of Poland and Romania are standard gauge, although the Romanians have done something to adjust this to get Ukrainian rail to them. Every schoolboy knows Romania's huge railway system has been starved of investment for years. I did not know that as a schoolboy, but obviously he did. And so the very simple idea of moving Ukrainian wheat to Constanta isn't going to work. Same goes for moving all that grain to the Baltic via the Polish railway system. The only way to move that grain is the way it has been moved in the holds of cross-trading bulk carriers. And so he comes in here with some options. Just possibly Ukraine and Russia will sign a peace treaty in the next month. That is plan A. Just possibly pigs might fly. I'm going to say he thinks that's low chance of probability. The other options are persuading Russia to permit neutral shipping to call at Ukrainian ports, which we will call plan B. Okay, well, that big one we've been talking about quite a bit, or destroying the Russian Black Sea fleet, plan C, or letting an awful lot of people go hungry. But think of the ton miles. And this is where he gets into. The most attractive solution might involve Russia allowing ships owned and controlled by nations who are well disposed toward Russia to load grain in Ukrainian ports. Call that plan B plus. Not an inherently silly idea. I would say yes, but you still have, for example, a Hong Kong flagged Costco container ship sitting in Odessa that can't get out and has not been able to get out of Odessa that entire time. Ship owners and other nations which are not friendly with Russia will benefit indirectly from ships being absorbed by the Ukrainian grain harvest. And since only ships acceptable to Russia will be permitted to load or sail from Ukrainian ports, these ships will have to ballast into positions which means, of course, lots of lovely ton miles all around. The option which will commend itself mostly to Ukraine is possibly the next one. Destroy the Russian Black Sea fleet, or at any rate, confine its ships at Sevastopol, where their tamed dolphins can protect them and blast their missiles out of the air. Let's call this plan C, might work too, if Ukraine gets and makes enough anti-ship missiles. I don't know if that's going to work. Assuming the destruction of the Black Sea fleet is a lot, plus it doesn't eliminate the one aspect of the Black Sea fleet that the Ukrainians can't get at, and that is submarines. And the submarines, the Kilo submarines, are the big, huge variable here. He goes on here, there's definitely scope to use the threat of Plan C to persuade Russia to support Plan B+. What's wrong with this idea? Again, my issue here is I don't think you can destroy the Black Sea fleet, not their submarines in particularly. They will be the variable element out there. Plus, the Ukrainians are fighting for control of Snake Island. The Russians have moved those jackup rigs into position off the coast. There's a lot going on here. And then you add these other stories here. Romania's top port unfit to solve EU's challenge to bring grain out of Ukraine, Constanta. The Romanian port has its limitations. It just can't handle the volume that is needed to get the Ukrainian grain out. Meanwhile, at the same time, Russia is taking advantage of Ukrainian ports. This story, shipped to take metal from Mariupol to Russia. There are ships loading in Mariupol, rolled steel from the docks there, being loaded by floating crane onto ships for transport to other places. And you have people like Admiral Stavridis, who is calling for the initiation of Black Sea ship convoys. I did a story, which was posted on GCaptain 2, about the problems associated with that, and it's a companion to the video I did on this subject. Obviously, the issue of Ukrainian grain is huge. It's massive. I saw somebody post, again, incorrect information on there about the amount of grain Ukraine deals with. Again, this material is readily available on open source, how much grain is exported from Ukraine and the amount that it's used to feed other nations. And the impact here is going to be dramatic. All right, let's go to our last story. All right, not gonna lie, my last story was going to be about cruise ships getting fire down in Grand Turk, running into mooring dolphins, because again, I like to talk about stories that I find that are not on the mainstream, but are interesting, and I was gonna do that. But this story caught my eye because it immediately has been retweeted out all over the place because of the implications of it. So I got to spend just a minute and talk about this, because I talk about a piece of US legislation called the Jones Act a lot. And what the Jones Act does is to move goods from one US port to another US port under Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which is known as the Jones Act. You have to be US owned, US flagged, US crewed, and US operated. Well, Maersk announced this. Maersk carries out its first international relay shipments in China. It goes on here to their statement. We are proud to be the first foreign company that successfully implements international cargo relay in China. Transshipment in China allows us to improve services through optimized networks and could also address some of the factors behind the bottlenecks in Chinese supply chains, shortening transit times, reducing emissions, and freeing up additional capacity for our customers. We appreciate this initiative by the Chinese authorities as an important step toward optimizing relay regulations, and we hope it will serve as an inspiration to other geographies where restrictions on international relay still exist. Soren Scow, the CEO of AP Moller Maersk, that was directed, by the way, at the United States. Just to be clear, that last little part right there, direct at the United States. All right, so what does this mean? 27 containers were loaded on board this vessel right here, the Maersk, for Vancouver, Canada. Now, they loaded this in the port of Shanghai, and they're sailing this vessel up to Tianjin. Now, in Tianjin, the 27 containers will come off the Maersk and go on to another Maersk vessel for distribution to Vancouver. Now, in the past, this was illegal. You couldn't do this. You couldn't move containers between ports. You can go to between various ports in China, load and unload, but you just couldn't pick up containers in one port and dump them in another port. And understand, that's not what they're doing. They're not doing cabotage. What they are doing, as they say very clearly here, is international cargo relay. In other words, all they're doing is picking up a container, loading it on a ship, taking it to another terminal, offloading it temporarily in the port zone for load onto another vessel. Now you're sitting there going, well, wait a minute, Sal, that's sounds like a great idea. And for China, this is a really good idea. Remember, the port that they're doing this in Shanghai has been huge problems with COVID lockdown. You're not getting the boxes in as you need. In other words, you've got shutdowns. You don't have trucks moving as freely as before. And so what China has right now is a huge backup. Now they've implemented this long before the COVID breakdowns. They've started doing this way back in 2019. This was part of a plan they developed. But this is alleviating part of that redistribution. A lot of containers, if you look at what FreightWaves and their sonar data has, a lot of containers are shifting out of Shanghai to other ports to move. And so that's what they're doing here. But the other element is in the Maersk brief here. And I want to go back down to it here for a second. The breakthrough they talk about here, and they talk about the meeting here and what's involved with it. Here it goes. Based on third country reciprocity conditions and meeting several additional criteria, qualified carriers can use its own vessels to carry out international cargo relay between Shanghai and northern Chinese ports, including Dailin, Tianjin, and Qingdao. I hope I said that right. I apologize if I got it wrong. So just a couple of questions right there. Third country reciprocity conditions, what are those? Does this mean that China can do the same now in the EU? Maersk is a Danish company. Has the EU signed off on allowing COSCO and the Chinese companies to do the same thing among their ports? And then the other thing, meeting several additional criteria. Pourquoi? What's the additional criteria here? What are the strings that are coming attached to this? Now, the reason behind this is, again, as I talked about, container congestion. But if you read down here a little bit too, you get another reason. In China, international cargo relay shipments between two Chinese ports have historically been considered cabotage and therefore are strictly prohibited for foreign carriers. Instead, these carriers use Busan, Singapore, and other international ports for transshipment. Haha. China is trying to steal this from Korea, from Singapore, from Japan, from other nations. They want to keep that business there. They're trying to shut out ports like Busan, like Singapore. And this is an effort of what they're doing. When the British got rid of their cabotage, which is always thrown back in my face, when the British get rid of cabotage, and in the 1840s, at that point, they were the dominant power on the world's oceans. They controlled almost half of the world's merchant marine. Today, COSCO is the largest shipping company in the world. COSCO is the third largest container liner in the world. COSCO shipping contains not just containers, but tankers and heavy lift and a few other things. That's why they're the largest in the world, but their container line is just third largest behind MSC and Maersk. However, this is part of a Chinese effort right here to control part of the marketplace. We've seen China doing this consistently in terms of shipbuilding. They're building more than any other country in the world, more than Korea, more than Japan. We've seen through their crewing practices and the fact that they prohibit crewing on board vessels in their ports. They are getting more ships to adopt Chinese crews than ever before. They are exerting a lot of control and again, those reciprocal agreements, those additional criteria, whatever they are, really need to be ironed out. What is Maersk agreeing to, and what is Maersk as part of the European Union agreeing to? I'd like to see the details of that. That's an interesting thing. Now, everyone's going to be screaming, Cato and a few other institutes are going to be screaming, look, China, they're getting rid of cabotage. Why don't we get rid of cabotage? Read into the lines what exactly this agreement is. It's not a wholesale rip the Band-Aid off of issues. This is a much different element here than just pure opening up coastal trade. This is very restricted out of Shanghai, trying to alleviate the backlog in the port of Shanghai that is causing a lot of congestion. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos. give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, share it across social media, and you can head on over to the Patreon page. Redone the Patreon page, got it all set up in a new way, trying to be more proactive with my Patreon subscribers. I want to thank my Patreon members, my contributors who've really just stepped up to help us. Pegleg Pete, James Bianco, Matthew Gustafson, who just came on board, Jay Mintzmeyer, Mark Wells, Bill Madden, Paul Dachow, and Jeff Lovelace. Appreciate everyone's support to the channel, everyone who's been a member of Patreon. I, again, appreciate that. And you are what allows this channel to exist and keep going, and hopefully bring you even more this summer as we retool and really aim to provide more professional, more up-to-date information than you're getting anywhere else on global shipping. Until our next video, this is Sal, signing off.